They had the typical mark of strangulation in the neck, and they had multiple fractures of the chest.
They needed to travel. I haven't been able to find this.
Well, your friend?
Well, everybody knows him, but no one.
Despite the upsurge in recent years of urban terrorism, it took the Airey Neve tragedy at the beginning of the campaign to bring security to the forefront of this election. The whole object of campaigning is to get as close to the voters as possible, so the better the campaigning, the greater the risk. A press and public free-for-all is a security man's nightmare. Jim Howell, an expert on American VIP protection, believes that politicians should never put themselves in this sort of situation.
Well, many times it's a problem of not so much doing what you should do, it's doing what you shouldn't do. And they ignore the security advice that's given to them.
Which is what?
Exposing themselves unnecessarily. Of course, a politician is interested to be in the public eye and to be very cordial and to mingle with the people. And that poses peculiar security problems for any security force.
But surely they have to do that. It's all part of an election.
It's all part of the election, but it's bad security.
So what do they do instead?
They make certain compromises which exposes them to an unnecessary risk, but apparently they make some determination that that's an acceptable choice on their part.
Mr. Howell, who is over speaking to other security professionals at an international conference at Olympia, admits there can be no such thing as total security during an election. He accepts, too, that the police cannot hope to provide the manpower for proper cover for all the candidates. Even the Prime Minister only has one obvious bodyguard, that's him in the background with the moustache, although others will be guarding from a discreet distance. But Mr. Howell feels that the biggest risk comes from where the police are least able to find it.
Typically it concentrates on people in organized subversive or revolutionary or dissenting groups, which is a particular problem because it's a distraction from the individuals who may be intent on violence, and it's much more difficult to defend an individual than a larger group.
But the police can't be everywhere.
They can't be everywhere, but the threat is greater from an individual sometimes than it is from the organized group on whom they can collect valid intelligence. Certainly when one confronts a lethal weapon, he must have adequate force to combat the situation. I would think that perhaps there is room for improvement in the amount of force available to them to cope with the situation once it develops.
Having seen yourself the sort of security that surrounds people in Britain compared with that in America, are you surprised that perhaps most of the assassinations, kidnap attempts have been on your side of the Atlantic and not here?
I'm very surprised at that because it appears to me as an individual and a security professional that the vulnerability is greater in Europe and especially in the United Kingdom.
Venice, it seems, has just got over one problem to find that she's left with others even more threatening. The good news is that the city is no longer sinking. But perhaps more serious, she's still the victim of high tides which flood the whole city to a depth of a foot or more every winter and spring. There were 7 such tides during this January and February. And even now, the wooden trestles in St. Mark's Square are left ready to be laid out as walkways the next time the sea floods in. The truth is that although the tourists are always here, whatever the weather, to enjoy the faded beauty of this decrepit old lady just for a day or so, Venice is damp and uncomfortable to actually have to live with. The high tides and seeping water are crumbling away the foundations and walls of its buildings, and 3,500 of its homes are now totally uninhabitable. No one has counted how many are just plain wet and unpleasant. One problem Venice does not have is a cash shortage. 6 years ago, £168 million were allocated to save the city, but only a fraction of it has actually been put to use. Why? Well, most Venetians blame what they call the infernal bureaucratic machine. First, there's the restoration of the famous public buildings. That's the responsibility of the central Italian government, but they've spent only 1/4 of the money allotted to them. Then there's pollution, which comes under a different authority, the regional council controlled by the Christian Democratic Party. And finally, there's the immense housing problem, which is the responsibility of a third government level, the communist-controlled city authorities. They've spent little more than 2% of the £60 million available to them. It can take up to 2 years to get permission to restore a single home. The result is that people just don't want to live in Venice anymore. From 180-odd thousand in 1950, the population has now dropped to 100,000 or less. The docks are the biggest employer and are also a typical example of the Venetian dilemma. The region want to create an extra 35,000 jobs in the port, but the government in Rome had a plan to control the high tides with a barrage across the lagoon, which unfortunately would block the shipping lanes to the port. The result? Both schemes seem to have been dropped. So the debate is whether Venice can be a living community, or whether she'll end up as a vast, sterile museum. And while the bureaucrats bicker about the answer, the city continues to crumble and die.
I should be warned to a frazzle if I didn't have so many friends here. Anyway, it's nice to see you all. Thank you very much. Thank you indeed. Thank you. Well, very nice to see you. There you are. Well, I'll wear that. I'm going to Edinburgh now. I'll wear that up to Edinburgh and say you gave it to me in Cardiff. Is that all right? You're a good girl. Thank you very much. Not all piecework. That's rubbish.
You've given it the unions have stopped it because that's the best way out.